Roadhouse is an action film about a former UFC fighter taking a job as a bouncer at a rundown roadhouse. In this movie, we follow Elwood Dalton, played by Jake Gyllenhaal. He is essentially a wanderer who is found by one Frankie, played by Jessica Williams. She's having problems at her small town roadhouse with incredibly violent people coming through, starting fights, and trashing the place. Dalton ends up going down to her place in Florida to help clean it up with his sick fighting moves, which puts him in the sights of some pretty dangerous people. So if you read the title of this video, then it should be pretty clear that violence takes center stage here, but at its core, this is a story about atonement. It's about a man with repressed inner demons looking to use his skills to help someone else for a change during a very dark time in his life. He's got a monster inside of him that's been tamed and masked by a new version of himself that's willing to help others rather than hurt them. Despite having incredible fighting skills, Dalton is presented as very kind and almost playful in his demeanor. Even when he's getting down to business and throwing punches, he's showing some sympathy for the other guys. He's not just beating them down brutally. But this movie's biggest shortcoming is that Dalton doesn't really have much for character dynamics. I would have liked to have seen a bit more of him connecting with his new associates. Dalton has a little bit of a thing with Ellie, played by Daniela Melchior, and meets the daughter of a bookstore owner named Charlie, played by Hannah Love Lanier. It didn't feel like Dalton had enough screen time with either of them for their dynamics to be compelling at all. They just felt like plot devices rather than characters we should care about. That obviously makes them, the supporting characters, feel disappointing, but it also just made Dalton feel kind of boring. I really would have liked to have seen him opening up to them. I want to shift gears and talk about the good for a second. The action scenes were pretty awesome whenever Dalton was fighting. They were choreographed and blocked very well. The way the camera moved with the action and how realistic a lot of the punches looked were both awesome. Probably because some of the punches were real, according to Conor McGregor. But that was really only when Dalton was the one fighting. There was a good chunk of the second act where he kind of just takes the bench and lets his bouncer proteges at the roadhouse do a lot of the work. So all of those dope action sequences were put aside while Dalton takes a bar stool, which was pretty unfortunate because for me, that's what made the movie so unique. The other big issue with this movie is that it didn't really walk the line between gritty and goofy very well. It has cheesy humor sprinkled throughout it that really didn't meld well with the movie's otherwise serious tone. The movie does mostly feel like it wants to be taken seriously. The amount of seriousness definitely outweighs the silliness, but there's occasionally just these really dumb writing bits. Gonna dodge spoilers here, but for example, there is an esteemed character in this movie who is just supposed to be Bad News Bears, but their nickname was something that a high school boy could have come up with. There's a good bit of cheesy humor that comes from the thugs. A lot of the criminals trashing the bar come from the same team, and as far as goons go, they were kind of just a joke. They are supposed to be these really intimidating guys, hence why all of the bouncers before Dalton couldn't handle the job because the guys were just so ruthless. But some of them were dumb in a childish way. At times, they just kind of felt like the bad guys in an Adam Sandler comedy. The other thugs that weren't silly really just spoke too much. They were often saying things like, "Oh, why don't you just shut up and fight, huh?" To which my immediate thoughts were just throw a punch like a normal thug would. They just kept indulging him like that to open the floor for Dalton to look and sound awesome, but in the process, they just came off as unconvincing criminals. I'm also gonna dunk on the casting and costume design here because boy, were some of these guys just not intimidating at all. Some of them just looked like dudes you would see at the grocery store wearing a polo t-shirt and jeans. It was as if the kingpin who hired them didn't actually know where to find ruthless criminals, so they just went to H&M and started asking shoppers if they needed a side hustle. My last complaint about the thugs is that they were conveniently only given guns when they were riding solo, and therefore really easy for Dalton to disarm. Otherwise, they came in big groups with their fists and knives. It was like an episode of Gotham where there's gun pointing, but nobody ever gets shot, so you know not to actually take it seriously when there is a gun pointed at someone. There were also some pretty cheeky bits leaning into the trope of it being a very small town. For example, word goes around really quickly about Dalton beating up those thugs at the roadhouse, and like the next day, everybody is passing by him going, "Hey Dalton, oh hey Dalton, oh hey Dalton." As if there is a citywide group chat for letting everyone know whenever somebody does something cool in this town. So I feel pretty mixed about Jake Gyllenhaal in this role. He's buff and he can play the innocent sides of the character very well, but once it came time for him to show the darker sides of the character, I wasn't really in love with him. I think it's just his voice. When it came time for him to feel scary and menacing, His voice just didn't really sound masculine enough. I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with not sounding incredibly masculine. I mean, listen to how I speak. I'm just saying that for what they were going for with this character, someone with a deeper, more gravelly voice could have made the character seem more intimidating when he needed to be. Conor McGregor made his acting debut in this movie, and I feel mixed about him too. He kind of just seemed like a vanilla villain. Of course, you know, the big culprit there is the writing and not necessarily him. But his performance at times felt a bit over the top. Like in his intro scene, he's walking down the road with this big cheesy grin on his face like, yeah, 'cause I'm a villain. I definitely don't want to jump to saying that he's a bad actor though. More often than not, when I hear somebody accuse bad acting, I tend to disagree and say that it's just bad dialogue or even sometimes bad directing. It's tough to say if that's the case here because I just haven't seen him in anything else. I don't know if that's his true acting game and that the director just didn't tell him to turn the smiley villain dial down, or if the director was the one who gave him the note of, okay, you're doing great, Connor, but I really just need you to channel your inner Joker. I guess in either case, the director could be blamed for this, but nevertheless, I'd like to see McGregor in more things before I say anything about his acting chops. So I think this movie really needed to lean harder in one direction or the other. They could have fully embraced the humor, almost like Argyle, where it relishes in stupidity, or they could have turned the humor dial down and embraced the grittiness and gave us more of those really well-shot action sequences. Because in the end, it just felt like a confused action movie that was held up by violence alone. I gotta say that I was a bit disappointed. This movie has a few delights and some really good ideas. I just don't think that they were executed very well. If you want something to stream at home while you're having some drinks, maybe with a +1, then this might be a good watch, but I wouldn't choose this for my next big movie night. Thank you for watching this review. If it brought you any value at all, please consider giving it a like. It really does help the channel grow. I'll see you later this week with my review of Godzilla and Kong: The New Empire.